Bufotes. Bufotes, the Eurasian green toads, or Palearctic green toads, is a genus of true toads family Bufonidae. They are native to Europe, absent from the British Isles, most of Fennoscandia, most of France and the Iberian Peninsula, Western and Central Asia, and Northern Africa, a region roughly equaling the Western and Central Palearctic. Historically, they were included in the genus Bufo, and then for a few years placed in Pseudepidalea, which is a synonym of the currently accepted name Bufotes. Bufotes are typical toads, and as suggested by their common names, most but not all species and individuals have a distinct greenish-spotted pattern. They occur in a wide range of habitats and mostly lay their eggs in fresh water, but sometimes in waters that are brackish. Appearance, size, and morphology. Bufotes are fairly small to medium-large toads with adults that are between about 3.5 and 12 cm, 1.44.7 in snout to vent length. The average size varies significantly depending on species, but there is still some overlap between most species when looking at their full-size range. Females of a species usually average larger than their males, whereas only males have a vocal sac. In shape and structure, they are typical toads. They have granular and often warty skin. Most have fairly distinct parotoid glands and tympanum. The B. certus subgroup consists of a couple of Asian species with smaller parotoid glands and a tiny or no tympanum, and they are sometimes called earless toads. Colors. Most Bufotes species, including all in mainland Europe, have upperparts that are pale to medium brownish, brownish olive, grayish, or cream, and with a usually conspicuous pattern of irregularly shaped darker spots that are green or greenish olive in color. The spots vary considerably depending on individual. In some they are fairly small, and in others they are large. They can be connected, sometimes forming a marbled pattern, or so dense that the toad appears almost all greenish or olive above. Some males can also appear quite uniform greenish or olive above. If the base color and color of spots are similar, females are almost always more contrastingly marked than males. Depending on species and individual, they can have a thin light yellowish vertebral line, an orangish tinge to the head, or fine reddish-orange dots above. In much of their range, they are the only toads with clear green markings, hence their common name green toad. In some species, the spots can be blackish or brownish on occasion, and even in species where they are greenish in life, they often become brownish in museum specimens. In some of the species outside Europe, among others B. batcheri, B. longus, B. pusoi, and B. sitabundus, females usually but not always have the typical greenish-spotted pattern, whereas males can have the typical pattern, can be mostly plain with little green, often only greenish spots to their limbs, or plain with no green. In two particularly plain-colored species, B. lauristanicus and B. certus of Iran and Pakistan, adults of both sexes either lack greenish spots, except sometimes on their limbs, or their greenish spots are small and typically of ring-like shape. If threatened, they can produce a white skin secretion that has an unpleasant smell. Ecology and behavior. Habitat. Depending on exact species and region, Bufotes can be found in steppes, grasslands, scrublands, bushlands, sand dunes, deserts, meadows, marshes, gravel pits, and forests, however, mostly quite open forests or in openings. In addition to natural habitats, many species will inhabit human, modified habitats like cultivated and urban areas, also when quite polluted. Some species may even occur in higher densities in human-modified habitats like city parks and gardens than in nearby natural habitats. Most species tend to live in arid to fairly arid habitats, often in places with sandy soils, but there are also species in moist habitats. When the weather is warm and dry, they regularly visit places with water or retreat to damp. In the most arid regions, they are usually restricted to areas near water sources like oases and river valleys, and they may estivate during the driest periods, in contrast to northern populations that hibernate in winter. They are quite tolerant of high temperatures and only die when they have lost about half their body fluids. Unusual among amphibians, the adults of some species of Bufotes are not restricted to fresh water, but can also occur in brackish, saline, or even hypersaline water. They can occur from sea level up to at least c. 3,800 and 12,500 ft in altitude, with many species having a quite wide altitude range, and some Central Asian species that are restricted to highlands. One record of B. Latestii at 5,238 and 17,185 ft, among the highest for any amphibian, is now considered erroneous. Breeding. Bufotes are mostly active during twilight and the night, staying hidden during the day, but when breeding they can also be active in the daytime. Breeding is seasonal, and the timing and duration varies with species and population. In colder regions, it is typically related to higher temperatures summer, and in warmer, drier regions related to higher rainfall wet season. To reach their breeding habitat, they can travel quite long distances, up to 5 km, 3 mi not being unusual. The males gather in groups at the breeding site and call from within or near the water at night. The frequency and pulse of the high-pitched, monotonous trilling call varies with Bufotes species, but in at least some the pulse is also related to temperature, being faster when warmer. Depending on species, a female can lay from a few hundred to a few tens of thousands black eggs, which are in a long single or double, gelatinous and transparent string. They can be deposited in many types of permanent or temporary waters like lakes, ponds, puddles, swamps, rivers, streams, torrents, reservoirs, and ditches, but usually in places no more than 50 cm, 1.6 ft deep. As in the adults, the eggs and tadpoles of some species are quite tolerant of higher salinities, and breeding can occur even in brackish or low saline water. The eggs and tadpoles are sensitive to polluted waters. They are also negatively affected by competition from common toad tadpoles and vulnerable to predation by fish more so than the unpalatable common toad tadpoles. The tadpoles feed on various plant matter and detritus along with small quantities of zooplanktonic organisms, but after metamorphosis into toadlets, they shift to a diet composed of small invertebrates. Taxonomy. Genus. The taxonomy of this group has caused considerable confusion. Species placed in Bufotes essentially equals the historically recognized Viridis green toad species group of the genus Bufo, although various other distantly species sometimes also were included in the group. In 2006, a major review revealed that this group should be moved out of Bufo into their own genus, Pseudepidalea. In 2010, it was shown that Pseudepidalea is a junior synonym of Bufotes. Shortly after, the divergent Brongersma's toad and Mongolian toad were moved to their own genera as Barbarophryne Brongersmi and Bufonidae respectively. Species, ploidy, and hybridization. Although several species or variants were described more than a century ago, most were generally included in Bufotes then Bufovirides until quite recently. In a major review of Eurasian toads in 1972, only the widespread B. virides and 3 more restricted Asian species were recognized in this group, but also including the Mongolian toad and natterjack toad, 2 species now known to be quite distantly related. In the following years, it became clear that this was an unsatisfactory taxonomy, as there were major variations in both morphology and ploidy. Starting in the late 1990s, several reviews have been published, and the number of recognized species has slowly increased as a result of revalidation of earlier described species and the description of new. Most of these were formerly considered part of B. virides. A few populations, especially those on Crete and certain Cyclades islands, still require further study to clarify their taxonomic position. While the European, Northern African, and Western Asian species all are diploid, Central Asia has species that are diploid: B. latestii, B. perini, B. sitabundus, and B. turensis, triploid: B. batcheri, B. Pseudepidalea, and B. zebmeri, and tetraploid B. oblongus and B. puzoe. Despite differences in ploidy, hybridization is still possible between some of them, and the 3 triploids and 2 tetraploids are the result of hybrid speciation, where the original parents were 2 diploid species. The 3 Central Asian species B. bacheri, B. pseudepidalea, and B. zebmeri are highly unusual in that they are entirely triploid in both sexes and reproduce sexually. All other known animal triploids are infertile, unisexual, that reproduce through parthenogenesis, gynogenesis, or hybridogenesis, or require varying ploidy for the widespread hybridization, both ancient and today, has also caused taxonomic problems among the diploid species. For example, in 2006, based on similarities in mitochondrial DNA, the population in northern Europe, northernmost Germany, Denmark, and southern Sweden was placed together with the populations from far southeastern Europe, southern Balkan, and Cyprus, and parts of Asia, Anatolia, and the Levant to Iran and Central Asia as the species B. variabilis. In between these widely disjunct populations of B. variabilis was B. virides. This was highly unusual from a zoogeographic point of view, and in 2019, a more comprehensive study found that the North European population is part of B. virides, the population of southern Balkan and adjacent parts of Anatolia is a hybrid zone between B. virides and B. sitabundus. The Cyprus population is its own species B. cypriensis. Since the type locality of B. variabilis is in Lübeck, Germany, the name is a synonym of B. virides. Earlier studies had been misled by primarily looking at mitochondrial DNA, which can be unreliable in species where there has been historical hybridization. Despite a relatively deep divergence between the species and their mostly allopatric or parapatric distributions, however, in Asia there are locations where as many 3 species occur together. Hybridization still occurs between some that come into contact today. For example, B. sitabundus and B. virides have a broad hybrid zone in Eastern Europe, mostly southern Balkan and European Russia, and Western Anatolia. B. Palearctic and B. virides have a relatively narrow hybrid zone in the region of far northeastern Italy, and B. palearctic and B. Bullingeri siculus only have very marginal hybridization. Interbreeding between Bufotes species and toads of other genera, including the common toad Bufo and natterjack toad Epidalea calamita, is usually rare, but very locally it can be more frequent. The intergeneric hybrid offspring often has a high mortality rate, and if reaching maturity it is presumed that their reproductive ability is low or none. They typically only occur under unusual circumstances, like places where both parent species have very small and isolated populations, limiting their chance if finding a partner of their own species, where species that typically are segregated by habitat or breeding ecology meet, or in captivity. Species list. There are currently 15 recognized species in the genus Bufotes. Within their range, each of the green-colored species is often just called green toad, but this can lead to confusion with distantly related species like the North American green toad Anaxyrus debilis. Balearic green toad, Bufotes Balearicus Bocher, 1880, 1880, 1880, 1880, 1880, 1880. Bachera toad, Bufotes Bacheri stock, Schmid, Steinlein, and Gross, 1999. African green toad, Bufotes Bullingeri lataste, 1879. Sicilian green toad, Bufotes Bullingeri siculus stock et al., 2008. Cyprus green toad, Bufotes cypriensis Litvinchuk et al., 2019. Ladakh or Baltistan toad, Bufotes Latastia Bullinger, 1882. Lauriston earless toad, Bufotes lauristanicus Schmidt, 1952. Eastern Persian toad, Bufotes oblongus Nikolskia, 1896. Perrin's green toad, Bufotes Perini Maesba et al., 2019. Puzo's toad, Bufotes Puzoe Bedriaga, 1898. Swat or Bachera green toad, Bufotes Pseudepidalea Mertens, 1971. Variable green toad, Bufotes.Bufotes, 1771. Iranian earless toad, Bufotes-Bullinger, 1891. Turan toad, Bufotes Hemmer, Schmittler and Bohm, 1978. European green toad, Bufotes Laurenti, 1768. Loch green toad, Bufotes Zubmeieri and Schmittler, 1973. References